Good afternoon. Welcome back. If you attended Mass or read the readings today, Matthew 12:46 to 50, every modern reader looks at this, and it's one of the most misunderstood passages in Christianity today. Many modern readers immediately assume that the expression "his brothers" is a nail in the coffin, if you will, of the debate as to whether Mary had other children. I want to start by saying, as a former anti-Catholic Protestant, that it is quite literally an overreaction to the Catholic claim that pushes particularly low church Protestantism to hammer in the notion that Mary had other children. It is a simple desire to debunk any notion of Mary's perpetual virginity, and above that, her very unique role in salvation history. Mary, in general, was one of the most difficult aspects of my grappling with the Catholic faith. And so I remember studying this particular question very clearly in 2009 or so, before I finally became Catholic in 2010. Now, Matthew writes that his mother and his brothers appeared outside, Matthew 12:46. The Greek text here uses a particular expression, he meta autou kai hoi adelphoi autou. Meta meaning mother, adelphoi meaning brothers. That key word, adelphoi. English readers will look at adelphoi and translate into siblings, brothers. The problem is ancient Jewish listeners to Jesus, they probably spoke Aramaic, and even if they spoke some variation between Aramaic and or Hebrew, the Hebrew language, and therefore adopted into the Aramaic, had no cultural distinction for the words like cousin, brother, nephew, fellow tribesman, an ally, a friend, a good friend, even a covenant companion. They all fell under the category of the Hebrew word ah. And the reason why is because in covenant, those distinctions tend to get flattened because we're all members of the same covenant family. They took blood ties and even extemporaneous ties seriously when you were in covenant with each other. And so that cultural context led to how the Greek translators and authors wrote the scriptures. And so the Septuagint, the Greek Bible, the translators and then the authors of the New Testament, all of them understood this Hebrew context, and they preserved that broad Hebrew cultural meaning. And so when you see the Greek word adelphos in the scriptures, they translated a Greek word with a Hebrew context in mind. They weren't looking for the typical Hellenistic Greek precision in language. And that's so important to understand, that there's a cultural context at play here. Genesis gives us a tremendous evidence. I'll prove this to you. In Genesis 13:8, the English translation says, "We are brothers." Abraham says this. Now, he says this to Lot, but if you know your story, you go back 2 chapters earlier, Abraham and Lot are not brothers, they're uncle and nephew. And so Abraham calls him brother, the Hebrew word once again, because there's simply no word for cousin and for nephew and for uncle in that sense. And so we can have confusion today because we're used to a lot more precision historically, but the Hebrew people weren't concerned with that kind of precision. Family meant family. Now, the same language appears in 1 Chronicles 23. This is, if you're interested, verses 21 to 22. The daughters of Eleazar marry the sons of Kish, who are called their brothers. Now, they weren't actually brothers of the daughters. They were cousins, according to a right reading of the genealogy. But Scripture says, well, they were cousins, and therefore they were brothers. Now, that linguistic pattern is deep in Second Temple Judaism. Aramaic was the daily language. This is after the Babylonian exile. The common Aramaic word for brother, aha, shared the same broad Semitic range as the Hebrew word ah. And so Jesus most certainly used that word, aha. And so his relatives would have heard him say, who are my aha, who are my brothers? And that language and the familial categories in that language extended beyond modern biological definitions and distinctions. But I want to give you another evidence that's a nail in the coffin for this issue. John's Gospel, I remember encountering this and what it did to me emotionally, realizing how wrong I was about Mary's perpetual virginity. John's Gospel, John 19:27. Jesus is hanging on the cross, and then he looks to John, and then he looks to, well, John, the beloved disciple. Then he looks to Mary. And then he looks to John and he says, "Behold your mother." Now, I didn't think anything of it when I first became Christian. I'm like, oh, okay, so he's dying and he wants someone to take care of his mom, I guess. But you have to understand, in first century Judaism, the eldest surviving son, after the death of the father, had the sole legal and liturgical responsibility for his widowed mother. Here he was hanging on the cross. And so what the Jewish law states, in fact, the entire Near Eastern legal system, but genuinely Judaism, what it states is, at the death of the eldest surviving son, the next son has the legal obligation of care of the mother. Jesus, while hanging on the cross, would not have broken Jewish law and so publicly humiliated his siblings if he had biological brothers. So if Mary possessed several biological sons, that public transfer would have been a violation of Levitical law, an insult to those brothers, and therefore a slap in the face of the Jewish community as a heritage. Every Jewish observer would have regarded that action as deeply inappropriate over and above his crucifixion. But Jesus said, "I did not come to abrogate the law, I came to fulfill it." And so his action of giving Mary to Jesus is actually the proof that in his, and the early Christians understood this, that in his role as her only son, Mary, ever virgin, needed to be handed into the legal care of someone else, and it was well within his covenantal right to do so. In fact, the earliest Christians consistently read that passage this way. Jerome, in his work Against Helvidius, he defended Mary's perpetual virginity, and Jerome demonstrated that men called the Lord's brothers belonged to another household. He even traced their family through the gospel narratives. Matthew identifies James and Joseph as sons of another Mary who stood near the cross. Mark identifies Mary, the mother of James the Younger, and of Joseph. John identifies this woman as Mary, the wife of Clopas. So the men called brothers belong to another mother whose identity the Gospels openly preserve. Her name was Mary. Now, some theories have it that our Blessed Virgin Mother Mary might have had a sister who was also named Mary, or at the very least a cousin who was also named Mary, hence the lineage, the kinship lineage. But early Christian historians, for some of them, like Hegesippus, he even identified Clopas as a relative of Joseph. Eusebius will preserve that tradition in his book, Ecclesiastical History. I can go on, but the point of the matter is history proves, and textual history proves, that the words in Scripture don't refer to biological heritage by itself. So the word firstborn in Luke, it's protokos. It's a reflection of the Hebrew word bekor. Jewish law granted that title to the child who first is born of the woman. The one who opens the womb is the language. Exodus 13:2 establishes that principle. The title doesn't require additional children. A lot of people look at the title, Jesus, her firstborn, meaning she had other children. No. Levitical law gives that title to the firstborn child, period, regardless of whether the woman has another child. Now, again, the Hebrew word mishpachah, it's a description of the extended household identity. Relatives regularly move together through village life. Nazareth probably contained only a few hundred residents. A dozen or so would have been related to each other, like every dozen or so. So Matthew's concern, who is my mother, who are my brothers? That question doesn't diminish Mary, and it doesn't diminish his relatives. Luke records her greatness through faithful obedience. Mary answers Gabriel, "Let it be done to me according to your word." No, Mary already embodies the very discipleship that Jesus is describing in the Scriptures. He doesn't repudiate her. So in all of this, as we wind down this commentary, the gospel today is a beckoning to every heart that when we look at this text, rather than superimpose the limitation of our modern understanding, let's be servants of the word and ask ourselves, what did the original authors intend to convey based on their cultural context? And if you ever have a doubt, then let's be humble servants of the magisterium and read the Scriptures from the mind of the church. Many of the fathers will reiterate this and draw us to a unified conclusion. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.